US President Joe Biden has seen his approval ratings take a nosedive. People across the globe have criticized the manner and pace of the US pullout of troops from Afghanistan. And now Democrats have lost Virginia in the governor's race. So what are the national implications of the same? Welcome to WION World is One. My name is Priyanka Sharma, and on this special broadcast of the WION VOA Co-Production, we analyze this story and a lot more. So let's get started. US Republicans won big on Tuesday in at least one off-year state election, that is. As Voice of America's Carolyn Presutti reports, some see the Democrats' losses in the state of Virginia as a warning sign for the party ahead of next year's midterm election, when all seats in the US House of Representatives and a third of the US Senate will be up for grabs. Take a look at this next report.
Two unwelcome surprises for Democrats. Republicans won the governor's race in Virginia for the first time in a decade, with a candidate who has never held public office.
All righty, Virginia, we won this thing!
And in New Jersey, Democratic Governor Phil Murphy won re-election, but in a much closer race that wasn't decided until Wednesday night.
Thank you, New Jersey! Thank you for putting your trust in our team for another 4 years.
In Virginia, Democratic gubernatorial candidate Terry McAuliffe tried to tie Youngkin to former President Donald Trump. He hoped to appeal to voters in a state that Democrat Joe Biden won by 10 points in the presidential contest. Republicans, meanwhile, focused on so-called kitchen table issues like taxes, education, and crime.
The public perception right now is that the Democrats who are in control of Washington can't get things done that they said they were going to do, and the Democratic brand is suffering.
Specifically, President Biden's Build Back Better Act. It would massively expand America's social safety net and combat climate change at a cost of $1.75 trillion. Here's what Biden said about it as Americans voted Tuesday.
It's going to lower inflation, raise wages, increase competition, create 2 million jobs a year.
But the bill remains stalled in Congress, as progressive and moderate Democrats can't agree on its many provisions. Republicans seized on Tuesday's election results as evidence that Americans are rebelling against the plan.
Democrats should listen to the voters. Drop this reckless taxing and spending spree and stop trying to ram through a socialist transformation that the American people never asked for.
But Democrats insist they will deliver on their promises to voters, including Build Back Better.
The challenges American families and workers are facing today are enormous, and President Biden's agenda is the remedy to much of their hardships. It's just what the American people want and what they need.
Off-year elections are often perilous for the political party that controls Washington. Democrats have thin House and Senate majorities to defend in next year's midterm elections, which typically bring gains for the opposition party. Tuesday's results in Virginia added to Democrats' gloom and Republicans' budding optimism heading into 2022. Carolyn Presutti, VOA News.
To discuss this further, we're now joined by Voice of America correspondent Chris Casquejo from Washington. Chris, thanks so much for joining us on this special broadcast. My first question, US President Joe Biden has seen his approval rating significantly drop, with more than half of Americans disapproving of his performance. What are the national implications of the Democrats losing in Virginia moving forward?
Good morning, Priyanka from D.C. It suggests that Democrats are in danger of losing control of both the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives in next year's midterm elections. Virginia's new governor-elect Republican Glenn Youngkin beat his Democratic opponent, former Governor Terry McAuliffe, by less than 2 percentage points. Youngkin handily won rural parts of the state and cut into the margins in the surrounding suburban D.C. counties that allowed President Biden to win the state last year. Youngkin was also successful in turning out former President Trump's base to vote. And while he welcomed Trump's endorsement, Youngkin did not campaign with him and rarely mentioned him in his public speeches. Experts believe more Republican candidates will adopt this approach because it shows they can win without Trump on the ballot. Republican control in a so-called swing state like Virginia could have implications for both the midterm elections next year and the U.S. presidential election in 2024. It's important to remember that U.S. elections are local and statewide contests with rules set state by state. Recently, Republicans have raised the issue of possible election fraud after former President Trump baselessly claimed the 2020 election was stolen. 19 states have now moved this year to restrict things like ballot drop-off boxes and early voting.
Right. Chris, while the elections might have brought disappointment to the Democrats, of course, history was made for Asian American candidates, including an Indian American, in 3 major U.S. cities. So what can you tell us and the viewers about the new mayors of Boston, Seattle and Cincinnati?
Well, Asian Americans are exercising political clout by winning the top offices in big cities. Let's start with Boston, where Michelle Wu, the daughter of Taiwanese immigrants, will be the first woman, first person of color, and first Asian American to serve as Boston's mayor, breaking the city's long tradition of electing white men to the top office. Wu gained voter support with promises to create free public transportation and award city contracts for jobs to close the racial wealth gap. Moving on to Seattle, Bruce Harrell, who is half Japanese and half black, will become the city's first Asian American and second black mayor. His campaign placed a strong focus on addressing Seattle's homelessness problem and increasing the city's police force. But he also promised to address concerns about systemic racism and implicit bias among first responders. Finally, in Cincinnati, Aftab Pureval, a lawyer and son of Indian and Tibetan immigrants, will become Cincinnati's first Asian American mayor. Pureval's campaign promised to rebuild Cincinnati's economy, reform its police department, and create more affordable housing, as well as address public safety and transportation. Cincinnati has a small Asian American population, about 2%. Pureval hopes his win will show not just that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders can run and win on the coast or where there are large Asian populations, but that AAPIs can run and win anywhere. It's a departure from 2015 when he won his first political office, county clerk. Back then he heard that he didn't have a good ballot name to appeal to the predominantly white voters.
Right, Chris, thank you so much for all those inputs. Stay with us on this broadcast. We'll come back to you for inputs on another story. Meanwhile, U.S. President Joe Biden announced ambitious climate commitments at the United Nations Climate Change Conference, that is the COP26 in the UK. He also slammed Chinese and Russian leaders for not doing their part and not showing up. Voice of America's White House Bureau Chief, Patsy Widakuswara, brings us this next report from Glasgow. Take a look.
Stopping deforestation and restoring 200 million hectares of forest and other ecosystems by the year 2030, backed by close to $20 billion in public and private funding. That's the pledge made by more than 100 world leaders at COP26, the UN climate conference in Glasgow, Scotland. Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro spoke via video link.
We are committed to eliminating illegal deforestation by 2030. I call on every country to help defend all forests, including with adequate resources for the benefit of all.
Methane emissions coming mainly from industries such as oil, gas, and coal will also be slashed. Leaders committed to cut levels 30% by 2030 under the Global Methane Pledge, an initiative pushed by the US and European Union.
So cutting back on methane emissions is one of the most effective things we can do to reduce near-term global warming and keep 1.5 degrees Celsius. It is the lowest hanging fruit.
With prospects for his climate legislation uncertain in Congress, U.S. President Joe Biden unveiled a series of domestic initiatives to support the deforestation and methane pledge. He slammed China and Russia for not doing their part.
But the fact that China, trying to assert, understandably, a new role in the world as a world leader, not showing up, come on. The single most important thing that's gotten the attention of the world is climate. Everywhere. From Iceland to Australia it just is a gigantic issue. And they've walked away. How do you do that and claim to be able to have any leadership mantle? The same with Putin and Russia.
China and Russia reject the accusation and say Western industrialized nations are the ones who need to do more, since they are responsible for most of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere today. Both countries have aimed to cut emissions by net zero by 2060, a decade after the global target. But they did commit to end deforestation.
We take the strongest and most vigorous measures to conserve it. We improve forest management and fight illegal logging and forest fires. We are expanding reforestation areas. We have been consistently increasing funding for these purposes.
Climate activists welcome the commitments but are still skeptical.
This is the problem with a lot of these commitments. There is an accountability gap. Governments made similar pledges in 2014 with the New York Declaration on Forests, but they didn't lead to anywhere near the progress that was expected.
COP26 negotiations will continue until November 12th, but one major proposal, ending coal dependency, was dead on arrival. At the G20 summit in Rome last week, leaders of the 20 largest economies could not agree on when to phase out this dirty source of energy that accounts for more than 70% of greenhouse emissions. Patsy Kuswara, VOA News, Glasgow, Scotland.
For more on President Biden's climate goals, we still have Voice of America's correspondent Chris Casquejo live with us on this broadcast from Washington. Chris, thanks for staying on. Now, the U.S. President used the sidelines of the COP26 summit to push for his vision for a green collaborative global infrastructure initiative. What are the prospects for these massive investments in other countries?
Priyanka, everything the Biden administration is doing in engaging global partnerships is designed to counter China, and this is no different. President Biden first unveiled his Build Back Better World, or B3W agenda, this summer, and he pushed it again in Glasgow this week. It's touted as a green and sustainable alternative for developing countries to China's multi-trillion-dollar Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. That international development program has financed infrastructure projects in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and made inroads in Europe. U.S. officials were in Ghana and Senegal this week to scout infrastructure projects. They made a similar trip to Latin America in September with stops in Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama. But so far, B3W is short on details and dollar amounts. As American officials embark on their B3W tours, countries will be looking for proof that the U.S. is offering a healthier alternative to China's BRI, which has been tarnished by negative environmental and social impacts, a lack of transparency and corruption, and has been criticized for leaving governments around the world strangled by debt. But it's clear that some countries are interested in having options beyond what China can offer. In Glasgow, major coal producer South Africa signed an $8.5 billion deal with the U.S., the European Union, and other European nations to install more clean energy alternatives and to help workers who may be impacted by the shift away from coal.
My final question for you, Chris. Much of the United States' plan on climate change is dependent, of course, upon the U.S. Congress. So where do things stand with that as of now?
Priyanka, the U.S. House of Representatives could vote today on both the $1.85 trillion social services package and $1 trillion infrastructure package. The climate change provisions are part of the infrastructure bill, mainly in the form of some $555 billion in tax breaks encouraging cleaner energy and electrified vehicles. If passed, it would be the nation's largest commitment to tackling climate change in history. But even if the House passes both the infrastructure and social services package, the Senate could still strip out provisions its members won't vote for in a process called reconciliation. The Senate is currently divided 50-50 among Democrats and Republicans, with Vice President Kamala Harris casting the tie-breaking vote. And moderate Democrats Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona have not signaled whether they will support the legislation. Priyanka?
Right, Chris. Thank you so much for all those inputs, and thank you for joining us on this special broadcast on WION at this hour.